My name is Nathan Hale, and for 22 years I believed my father had chosen money over his own son without feeling a single ounce of regret. The last memory I had of him was standing at the end of our long driveway outside the small farming town of Silver Creek, Kentucky, avoiding my eyes as my grandmother drove me away, leaving me convinced that I had been erased from his life forever. I was only 10 years old when everything fell apart, and nobody ever gave me an explanation that made sense to a frightened child trying to understand why his family had suddenly shattered overnight. My mother looked me straight in the face and calmly told me that my father wanted a fresh start without me, repeating those words so many times over the years that I eventually accepted them as an undeniable truth, even though every memory I had of him told a completely different story. Growing up with my grandmother changed me into someone who trusted actions more than promises, because every promise I had ever believed had been broken without warning. I buried myself in studying veterinary medicine, eventually building a respected career in Colorado where I spent my days rescuing injured horses, cattle, and wildlife, earning the admiration of strangers while quietly carrying an emptiness that no amount of professional success could ever replace. One cold autumn evening, after helping save a champion mare during a difficult birth, the grateful owner wrapped me in a heartfelt embrace and thanked me for giving his family hope when they thought everything was lost. Driving home through miles of silent mountain roads, I realized that I had spent years helping other families stay together while never finding the courage to face the painful questions about my own, and that thought lingered in my mind long after I reached my empty house. Everything changed a few weeks later when my grandmother convinced me to attend our annual family reunion at a quiet lakeside cabin in northern Michigan, insisting that hiding from the past would never allow me to build a better future. During dinner, my young cousin innocently asked why nobody ever talked about my father anymore, and the laughter around the table disappeared so quickly that I could hear the ticking clock on the wall, while every adult exchanged nervous glances that told me a secret had been buried for far longer than I ever imagined. That night I could not sleep because the strange silence at dinner kept replaying in my mind, and every nervous expression I had seen around the table made me wonder whether everyone except me had been living with the same secret for years. I quietly stepped outside onto the wooden dock overlooking the lake, hoping the cool night air would clear my thoughts, when my phone suddenly vibrated with a message from a number I had never seen before that simply read, "If you truly want to know why your father let you go, leave before sunrise and tell no one." My first instinct was to dismiss the message as some cruel prank, but another text arrived less than a minute later containing the exact date I had been sent away from home and the nickname my father used only when we were alone together. A chill ran through my body because those details had never been shared with anyone outside my family. And before I could respond, a third message appeared warning me that someone at the reunion would do everything possible to stop me from learning the truth. Before dawn I quietly packed a small backpack, slipped out of the cabin without waking anyone, and followed the directions that had been sent to my phone until they led me to an abandoned train station nearly 30 miles away. Waiting beside the empty platform was an elderly man wearing a faded denim jacket, and after studying my face for several long seconds, he introduced himself as Walter Dawson before saying he had once been my father's closest friend and had spent more than 20 years waiting for the day he could finally keep a promise. Walter reached into an old leather briefcase and carefully placed a worn photograph and a sealed envelope on the bench between us, explaining that my father had trusted him with both items on the night my life changed forever. The photograph showed my father smiling with his arm around me when I was a little boy, but written across the back in my father's handwriting were words that made my heart pound faster because they read, "One day my son will know I never stopped fighting for him." Before I could ask another question, Walter looked directly into my eyes with quiet sadness and admitted that everything I believed about my father had been built on lies carefully created by the people I had trusted the most. He took a slow breath before revealing that my father had never abandoned me willingly, and that the real reason I was sent away had nothing to do with rejection but everything to do with protecting my life from a dangerous secret hidden inside our own family. For several long moments I could not speak because Walter's words shattered the story I had carried in my heart since childhood, and every painful memory suddenly felt uncertain in a way I had never imagined possible. I demanded proof before I believed another unbelievable claim and instead of arguing with me, Walter quietly slid the sealed envelope across the bench and said my father had written every word himself more than 20 years earlier. My hands trembled as I carefully opened the faded envelope, discovering several pages filled with my father's unmistakable handwriting that seemed rushed in some places and painfully steady in others, as though every sentence had cost him a piece of his heart. The first line immediately stole the air from my lungs because it said that if I was reading those pages, it meant he had either lost his fight or finally believed I was safe enough to learn the truth that had been hidden from me for most of my life. According to the letter, everything began the evening I accidentally wandered into my grandfather's office while searching for one of my toy trucks, where I unknowingly witnessed my mother and my uncle removing financial records from a locked cabinet before replacing them with forged documents. At the time I was too young to understand what I had seen, but my father realized that my innocent curiosity had turned me into the only unexpected witness to a fraud that had been quietly draining the family's fortune for several years. My father wrote that he confronted them privately the following morning, believing they would admit their crimes and stop before anyone else was heard. But the meeting quickly turned into a terrifying series of threats that changed the course of all our lives forever. My uncle warned that if my father reported the theft or tried to expose the truth, both of us would suffer the consequences, and my father soon realized they were desperate enough to destroy anyone standing in their way. The final page of the letter contained words that blurred beneath my tears, because they revealed the heartbreaking reason behind the only sentence I had ever heard him say on the day we were separated. He explained that telling me to leave was the hardest decision he had ever made, because he believed it was the only way to keep me alive, while he secretly spent the next 20 years gathering evidence that would one day expose everyone who had stolen not only our family's legacy, but also the precious years we should have shared together. I sat in complete silence after reading the final page, because the father I had spent more than 20 years blaming suddenly became the man who had sacrificed everything to keep me alive, and the hatred I had carried for so long dissolved into overwhelming guilt. Every memory I had treasured as proof that he had abandoned me now looked completely different, and for the first time since I was a child, I found myself wishing I could hug him just once and tell him I finally understood. Walter gave me time to gather myself before opening another folder that contained copies of court records, bank statements, handwritten notes, and photographs collected over 2 decades, proving that my father had never stopped fighting behind the scenes. He explained that while I was building a new life in Colorado, my father had quietly worked with attorneys, private investigators, and financial experts to expose the network of fraud that had stolen millions of dollars from my late grandfather's business and placed the blame on innocent people. As I turned each page, I discovered something that broke my heart even more than the lies themselves, because my father had secretly followed every important milestone of my life without ever interfering. He had kept newspaper clippings about my graduation, photographs from veterinary award ceremonies, and even a magazine article praising my work rescuing injured horses, with little notes in the margins saying how proud he was of the man I had become, despite never being allowed to stand beside me. Walter then looked at me with tears in his own eyes and quietly revealed the one truth I had feared hearing since opening the letter, explaining that my father had passed away only 8 days earlier after a long battle with heart disease. He said my father had spent his final hours repeating my name and asking only one question, hoping until his very last breath that I would someday learn the truth, instead of spending the rest of my life believing I had never been loved. Before leaving the station, Walter handed me one final envelope marked with the words "Open only after you know everything," then told me the reading of my father's will would take place the following morning at the office of his attorney in downtown Louisville. He warned me that my mother and uncle were already convinced they would inherit the entire family estate, but neither of them had the slightest idea that my father had spent years preparing one final surprise that would change every one of their lives forever. The next morning I walked into the law office with a heart that felt heavier than it ever had before, and the moment I stepped through the conference room doors I recognized several relatives who had not spoken to me since I was a little boy. My mother barely acknowledged my presence, while my uncle wore a confident smile that suggested he had already decided how the meeting would end, as though my return meant absolutely nothing to the future of the family estate. A few minutes later, the attorney, Richard Lawson, entered the room carrying several thick binders and a locked metal case. Waiting until everyone was seated before calmly explaining that my father had left behind detailed legal instructions that could not be challenged or interrupted, the confidence on my mother's face slowly began to fade when Richard announced that every document had been prepared years in advance, witnessed by multiple attorneys, and secured in different locations to prevent anyone from altering or destroying my father's final wishes. The first surprise came when Richard revealed that my father had quietly transferred ownership of the family's ranch, farmland, and livestock business into an independent trust nearly 15 years earlier, placing every asset under legal protection long before anyone realized what he had done. My uncle immediately jumped to his feet, accusing the attorney of presenting fake paperwork, but Richard calmly opened the locked case and produced the original documents bearing official court seals, certified signatures, and financial records that left no room for argument. Before anyone recovered from the shock, two investigators entered the conference room carrying additional evidence collected during a years-long financial investigation that had remained confidential until my father's death. They displayed records showing unauthorized transfers, forged contracts, hidden bank accounts, and property purchases connected to my mother and uncle, proving that the fortune they believed belonged to them had actually been built through years of deception, fraud, and carefully hidden crimes. The room fell into complete silence as every lie that had shaped my childhood began collapsing in front of everyone who had once believed I was the unwanted son who had simply disappeared without reason. While my mother stared helplessly at the mountain of evidence and my uncle struggled to explain the impossible, I quietly realized that my father's greatest act of love had never been the inheritance he left behind, but the 22 years he spent protecting my future until the truth was finally strong enough to stand on its own. Please subscribe to our channel and share this video with your friends and family. We create entertaining and inspiring stories for our viewers, and your support helps us continue making great content for you.